Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a sutta study with Bhante Suddhaso. And good morning so far to Aum, as well as Aya Vimalanyani. Good to see you, Venerable, as always. Good morning as well to our friend Kyle, Kumu, Abby, Mark, Jens, and hello as well to everyone else who is just viewing at this time. But at any time during the talk, feel free to type in questions and I will bring them up at the end. But for now, I'll pass things over to Bhante Suddhaso for this morning's sutta study.
Okay. Start by paying homage to the Buddhas. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ Dhammaṃ Sanghaṃ Namassāmi. So, hello again, friends. This morning we'll be looking at the Pachalayamana Sutta, which is from the Anguttara Nikaya, Book of the Sevens, Sutta number 61, which is translated here as Dozing. This is a discourse about what to do when you're sleepy during meditation, which some of us may have experienced from time to time. And this sutta, basically it has two parts. The first one is a list of 7 specific tactics for what to do if you notice that you're falling asleep during meditation. And then after that is a list of several ways of adjusting our behavior so that we're less likely to be drowsy during meditation in the first place. So as usual, I'll go through the sutta and give some explanations as we go along. And then at the end, I'll take any questions that you might have. So the sutta begins. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the fortunate one was living among the Bhaggas on Crocodile Hill in the deer park at Baisakala Grove. At that time, Venerable Mahamoggallana was among the Magadhans at Kalavalaputta village and was dozing while sitting. So this is most likely before Mahamoggallana attained enlightenment. So while he was still trying to purify his mind and develop samadhi and wisdom, and he was having an experience which, again, is very relatable. He was trying to do sitting meditation and he kept nodding off. He was dozing off while he was trying to do sitting meditation. So usually when one is trying to do sitting meditation, there are 2 very common tendencies of mind which obstruct our practice. One is restlessness and the other is dullness. And often, if you're not experiencing one, then you're experiencing the other. And sometimes we seem to just keep bouncing back and forth between the 2. Again, Mahamoggallana here is having this perfectly ordinary and common experience of trying to do sitting meditation and just drifting off the whole time. So the sutta continues. After seeing this, just as a strong person would extend a contracted arm or contract an extended arm, the fortunate one vanished from Baisakala Grove and appeared at Kalavalaputta village in front of Venerable Mahamoggallana. I just want to put in, by the way, I find this incredibly adorable. There's actually many, many suttas where the Buddha's teleporting around giving instructions to different monastics in different places. And for some reason, I don't think I've ever heard anyone draw attention to this fact. They just kind of skip over the sentence as though it's not in the sutta, and they're just like, and the Buddha gives some teachings. And it's like, wait a minute. The Buddha was like way over there, and he teleported all the way over there just so that he could give instructions to this monk who was nodding off during his meditation. Seriously, how cool is that? And it also emphasizes, as I said yesterday, that the Buddha was not an ordinary person. He was an extraordinary person. We tend to emphasize the Buddha's wisdom a lot. We also talk about his compassion. But it's good to keep in mind that the Buddha also had mastery over the physical world. The Buddha also had a full set of psychic powers, which he used as supports to his Dhamma teachings, as ways to enhance his ability to explain the Dhamma to others. So, of course, there was only one Buddha and lots of people who needed teaching, and the Buddha wasn't everywhere at all times. So sometimes he needed to travel very quickly from place to place. So in many suttas, the Buddha walks from place to place, and in many suttas, he just teleports around, which, again, I find really wonderful. The fortunate one sat on the designated seat and said to Venerable Mahamoggallana, "Are you dozing, Moggallana? Are you dozing, Moggallana?" And he replies, "Yes, Bhante." So again, I just want to set the stage. So let's imagine that you're sitting alone in meditation and you're kind of drifting off. And then suddenly, boom, the Buddha teleports in front of you and he's like, "Are you nodding off?" And you're like, "Ooh, yes, Bhante. Yes, it's true. It's true." By the way, interestingly enough, in the Agama parallel to the sutta, it's not phrased as a question. It's just phrased as a statement. The Buddha just says, like, "Moggallana, you're nodding off." Like, it's not a question in the Agama version. Minor interesting detail, doesn't really affect the meaning of it. Anyway, so then the Buddha starts going into his straightforward, practical recommendations. And the very first one he gives, he says, "Then, Moggallana, do not pay attention to whatever perception you were maintaining when you fell into drowsiness. Do not continue with that perception. Moggallana, by doing this, it is possible that you will abandon your drowsiness." So this first one, it's very straightforward. He's saying, well, whatever you're doing with your mind, stop doing that, because it's clearly not working. If it was working, you wouldn't be falling asleep. If you were doing a meditation practice that was actually helpful to you right now, interesting to you right now, then you would be devoting all your attention to it. You would be maintaining a clear, ongoing awareness of it. So whatever you're doing that's resulting in you nodding off, well, clearly this isn't the right time to be doing it. So I really like the practical approach that the Buddha is emphasizing here. He's really emphasizing the results. So it's possible that the meditation method that you're using is actually a good method, but at this time, the result is that it's just putting you to sleep. So that means it's not the right method for you to use right now. An example of this that we find elsewhere in the suttas, when the Buddha is talking about the 5 hindrances and the 7 factors of awakening, he gives the example of when the mind is very sleepy, then you shouldn't be focusing on developing tranquility. You shouldn't be focusing on developing equanimity, because those are the sorts of things that will just put your mind, make your mind even more sleepy. Those are the sorts of things that will just make your hindrance of drowsiness even worse. Let's see, Sattva Vivacchya, Virya, Piti, Passaddhi. And on the flip side, he says, if your mind is very restless, then you shouldn't be developing factors like energy or investigation of Dhamma, because that can just make your restlessness and agitation even worse. So again, he's giving this clear thing of saying, like, well, you need to be attentive to the current needs of your mind. And recognize that at different times you need to use different methods. If your mind is prone to dullness and drowsiness right now, then you need to use more energetic, more invigorating meditation methods. And if your mind is prone to agitation and restlessness, then you need to use pacifying and tranquilizing meditation methods. So a common example of this is people come to the monastery and they're getting up at 4 in the morning and stumbling zombie-like into the meditation hall, and they slump into their seat, and then they close their eyes and they start focusing on paying attention to their breathing. And it's like, oh, so peaceful. Oh, so peaceful. And then the bell rings an hour later and they're like, oh, so peaceful. And yeah, that's true. That's peaceful, but it's not productive. It's not really of any benefit. So in that case, you should not be practicing mindfulness of breathing. So mindfulness of breathing is normally considered to be a pacifying meditation, a soothing meditation. So if you're already prone to drowsiness and sleepiness and nodding off, then that's not the right time to be doing mindfulness of breathing, probably. There's ways of doing breath meditation that are energizing, but normally the most common ways are soothing, pacifying. In fact, the Buddha recommends mindfulness of breathing when you're agitated, when you're restless and worked up. Then mindfulness of breathing can be a way of calming that down. So this is, again, it's very practical. It's just asking yourself, what was I doing when I started nodding off? What was I doing that was contributing to my drowsiness? Well, I need to stop doing that and do something else. Something that is more interesting or more invigorating instead. Then the Buddha gives the next example. He says, if you do not abandon your drowsiness by doing that, Moggallana, then you should think about and mentally explore the Dhamma that you have heard and learned. You should mentally examine it. By doing this, it is possible that you will abandon your drowsiness. So this also is an interesting one because it shows that meditation practice does not necessarily mean having a silent mind. That thinking about, pondering, considering, mentally investigating and analyzing the Dhamma is all a perfectly valid form of practice because it cultivates wisdom. It cultivates understanding. And also it keeps the mind constantly pointed towards the Dhamma. So it's building up the habit of the mind thinking about Dhamma. So if we spend all our time thinking about movies and games and television shows and celebrity gossip and so on, then what we're doing is we're building up the habit of thinking about useless things. So then what sort of thoughts are going to constantly be appearing in the mind? Thoughts about movies and celebrity gossip and so on. That's what's going to constantly appear in the mind because that's what we're training the mind to think about. So if, on the other hand, we consciously direct the mind towards thinking about Dhamma, then those are the kinds of thoughts that are going to appear in the mind. So then the mind will constantly be circulating around Dhamma themes, constantly reflecting on Dhamma. And when we reflect on Dhamma, then we tend to understand Dhamma. When we reflect on Dhamma, then we're more likely to live in accordance with Dhamma. So this is a really useful thing to do. You don't necessarily need to force your mind to be silent all the time, but do make sure that your mind, when it's active, it is actively thinking about Dhamma or actively relating your experience to Dhamma in some way. Then the next practical example the Buddha gives, he says, if you do not abandon your drowsiness by doing that, Moggallana, then you should pinch your earlobes and rub your limbs with your hands. By doing this, it is possible that you will abandon your drowsiness. So here we have another, again, very practical example. Sometimes what helps us to come back into the present moment and cultivate attention and alertness is to generate a strong physical sensation. So tugging on your ears or pinching your earlobes generates a strong sensation that can kind of snap us out of our daydream reverie and bring us back to a direct experience of the body. Similarly, rubbing your arms or legs produces a strong sensation. It helps us to pay attention again to our body. So coming back into mindfulness of the body through intentionally generating a physical sensation. This can be, again, a potent way of sharpening the mind. A more subtle way of this, a more subtle thing that you can do is, if you're sitting with your hands together in your lap, you can just gently rub your fingers together. And sometimes that can be enough just to get your attention back into your body. The next one he gives, he says, if you do not abandon your drowsiness by doing that, Moggallana, then you should get up from your seat, rub your eyes with water, look around in all directions, and look up at the stars. By doing this, it is possible that you will abandon your drowsiness. So this also is quite practical. If you're having a hard time staying awake doing sitting meditation, then stop sitting. Stand up, get up. Splash cold water on your face. This is actually really effective. A really effective way of bringing some brightness to the mind for at least a few minutes. Look around in all directions. So this also is interesting. So it's cultivating a sense of sensory input. This is another problem which sometimes happens in terms of drowsiness with meditation. So you go and you sit in a dark, quiet room and you close your eyes and you hold still. And since you're shutting off a lot of your sensory input, then sometimes the mind is like, well, looks like we're shutting down, might as well go all the way and shut down completely. So looking around in all directions, it's like, no, wait, I'm actually in a spatial world occupied by objects. There are sensory impressions going on. There is activity happening. There is sensory input. So it's reminding us to wake up and pay attention. This is not sleepy time. It's a time to pay attention to what's going on. Then the next one he gives, he says, if you do not abandon your drowsiness by doing that, Moggallana, then you should pay attention to the perception of light, the night as the day as the night. In this way, you should develop an open mind, a mind of unveiled radiance. By doing this, it is possible that you will abandon your drowsiness. So the perception of light, I must confess this is a meditation method that I don't have much experience with. I haven't cultivated it much. And I actually don't know that many monks who have made much of a point of developing the perception of light. It is mentioned in a few places in the suttas, though. And ways it's sometimes spoken about practicing is to visualize a bright light. So focusing your mind on this perception of a bright light in the mind. And that has a way of cultivating alertness, cultivating awake, sharp, attentive mind. Then the next option he gives, he says, if you do not abandon your drowsiness by doing that, Moggallana, then you should commit to doing walking meditation. Paying attention as you walk back and forth with your sense faculties withdrawn and your mind focused inward. By doing this, it is possible that you will abandon your drowsiness. So again, a very practical thing. If the sitting meditation is really not working for you, then do walking meditation. It's very hard to fall asleep when you're doing walking meditation. I'm not sure I've ever even heard of it happening. I've heard of people falling asleep during standing meditation. I recall one time many years ago during morning meditation, we were all sitting quietly doing our sitting meditation, and then one of the people was apparently quite sleepy that morning, so he was doing standing meditation. And about halfway through the meditation hall, we hear this whoomp. And the person had actually fallen completely asleep while standing and then toppled over. They were fine, but it did wake up everybody else in the hall as well. But yeah, walking meditation. This is a great way to cultivate alert attention. I've known a number of people over the years who find it very difficult to maintain alertness during sitting meditation. So they do a lot of walking meditation. So during walking meditation, you can cultivate mindfulness of the body. You can cultivate sense restraint. So as you're walking, you're keeping your eyes down. You're not looking around. The Buddha says to keep your mind focused inward. In other words, not directing your mind towards looking at things or thinking about what's going on around you, but just constantly keeping your attention focused inward on your own body-mind. So walking meditation when you're sleepy is very effective. It's highly recommended. And after you do walking meditation for a little while, then you can do some more sitting, and you'll find that the mind is usually substantially sharper and clearer. Then the last option the Buddha gives, notice this is the last option, not the first one. So the Buddha says, if you do not abandon your drowsiness by doing that, Moggallana, then you should recline on your right side like a lion, with one foot on the other, mindful and aware, keeping in mind the intention to get up. When you wake up again, Moggallana, quickly get up, thinking, I will not live devoted to the pleasure of sleep, the pleasure of lying down, the pleasure of drowsiness. Moggallana, this is how you should train yourself. So the final option the Buddha gives, if you're experiencing a lot of drowsiness during your meditation and you've tried everything else and it doesn't seem to be working, it's possible that you actually just need to get a little bit of sleep. It's possible that you actually do just need to go and rest for a while. So the Buddha says, if that's the situation you're in, then just go and take a little nap, or possibly a long nap. Go and lie down for a while. And here we see the what's called the lion's posture, which is the recommended sleeping posture that is spoken about many times in the suttas, which is to sleep on your right side. So not to sleep on your back or on your stomach or on your left side, but to sleep on your right side. And it's never clearly stated why in the suttas, but it's said that sleeping on the right side is a more peaceful way of sleeping. So elsewhere in the suttas, he says that to sleep on your back is to sleep like a corpse. To sleep on your stomach is to sleep like a sensualist, I think. To sleep on your left, oh gosh, I don't remember. Do any of you remember this sutta?
I remember the sutta, but I don't remember the correlations.
Yeah, anyway, he gives rather not nice explanations for the other three postures and culminates by saying, you should sleep on your right side like a lion. So with the nobility and ease of a lion. And he says that you should lie down with mindfulness. And you should have the intention to get up when you wake up. And he says here to have this thought of, I will not live devoted to the pleasure of sleep, the pleasure of lying down, the pleasure of drowsiness. In other words, recognizing that there actually is a pleasantness in lazing around in bed. There actually is a certain kind of pleasure in drowsiness, a certain kind of pleasure in this dull, hazy, drifting mind. And we don't want to cultivate attachment to that pleasure. If we cultivate attachment to the pleasantness of the dull, drifting, hazy mind, then we're much more likely to fall into that kind of mind state during meditation. Instead, we want to cultivate an appreciation for a bright, alert, clear mind. We want to cultivate appreciation for a mind that is awake, serene, and clearly aware. So it's, of course, it's necessary to sleep, and if you don't sleep enough, then that will lead to drowsiness during meditation. But also, if you just spend a lot of time laying around in bed when you don't need to, then that will also cultivate drowsiness during meditation. So it's about knowing the right amount, not too little, not too much. And this varies for different people. So it's important to get a sense of it for yourself. So next, the Buddha goes into several recommendations for ways to train the mind so that drowsiness is less likely to happen in the first place. And these I find really interesting because the connection with drowsiness is not immediately apparent. So then next he says, furthermore, Moggallana, this is how you should train yourself. I will not approach families arrogantly. Moggallana, this is how you should train yourself. Moggallana, if a monk approaches families arrogantly, it may be that there are activities being done by those families, and they will not pay attention to the monk. Then that monk will think, now who has turned this family against me? These people no longer like me. When one doesn't get anything, one becomes ashamed. When one is ashamed, one becomes agitated. When one is agitated, one becomes unrestrained. And when one is unrestrained, the mind is far from concentration. So this is pointing to the importance of humility and contentment. So here the implication is the monk is going to visit some lay people, and there's some kind of expectation. He's expecting to get attention, he's expecting to get praise, he's expecting to get gifts, and instead they ignore him. And he gets upset and ashamed and irritated. And when the mind is filled with those kinds of unpleasant mind states, then we actually don't want to be present for it. We don't want to be attentive to a mind that's uncomfortable. So the escape is to fall asleep. The escape is to drift off. So this is something which contributes to the causes of drowsiness, namely arrogance and expectation from others. Next, he says, furthermore, Moggallana, this is how you should train yourself. I will not speak argumentatively. Moggallana, this is how you should train yourself. Moggallana, when one speaks argumentatively, it is expected that there will be a lot of talking. When there is a lot of talking, one becomes agitated. When one is agitated, one becomes unrestrained. And when one is unrestrained, the mind is far from concentration. So here again, we find a really lovely example here. So not getting caught up in arguments, not seeking argument, not seeking contention, and not getting caught up in a lot of talking. So I recall in the past when I've had arguments with people, then the argument tends to keep echoing in my mind for hours or even days. And I'm thinking about, well, he said this and she said that, and I should have replied this way, and why didn't I say that? And I don't like how that was handled. Like the mind just keeps rolling around the argument. And when we're like that, once again, concentration becomes very difficult. Samadhi is not easy. When we're constantly rolling around in the arguments that we've been having recently. And also when we're doing a lot of talking, then what happens? Then we're instigating movement of mind, which then makes it harder to concentrate. And when our concentration is poor, then it's difficult to remain awake and alert. Though this one does seem to be pointing more towards restlessness, as indicated when he says agitation. So this leads, a lot of arguments and talking tends to lead to agitation of mind. But that can also lead to a weariness of mind. A weariness of mind which then contributes to drowsiness. Next, the Buddha says, he says, Moggallana, I do not praise all association, nor do I dispraise all association. Moggallana, I do not praise association with lay people and monastics. But I do praise association with residences that are quiet, are free of the sound of voices, seem unpopulated, are far from human dwellings, and are suitable for retreat. So the word translated as association is, in Pali, it's sangsagga, which you could also translate as intimacy. So spending time together, constantly interacting with each other. So he says it's not necessarily good to be spending a lot of time with other people, whether they're lay people or monastics. It's not necessarily good to be developing intimate relationships. And by intimate here, I don't mean sensual or sexual relationships. I just mean knowing every detail of each other's lives, knowing every detail of each other's emotions and thoughts. It's not really necessary. It's not really helpful even for our practice. In fact, that all just tends to contribute to agitation in our own mind, and it tends to contribute to attachment. It tends to just keep getting us wrapped up in other people's affairs and other people's issues, as if dealing with our own issues weren't already overwhelming enough. So instead, the Buddha says that we should be spending time in places that are quiet, free of the sound of voices. So here at the monastery, we often practice silence. So limiting the amount of speaking and talking that we engage in. Recognizing that when there's a lot of talking, then that's not good for meditation practice. It tends to agitate and stir up the mind. So we try to minimize the amount of talking that we engage in, because it's ultimately not particularly helpful for our practice. I also like this phrase, living in a place that seems unpopulated. Again, I get that feeling here sometimes at the monastery, where be going around in the afternoon, and even though I know there's several other people living here, it seems the place seems abandoned. It seems deserted. Everyone's off doing their meditation or their study quietly in other rooms. You might wander into a room and see somebody sitting in meditation or reading a book, but still there's this sense of like, oh, this place seems unpopulated. It doesn't have the noise and vivacity that one would expect of an occupied dwelling. I remember when I was young, living with my family when I was a child. And at one point, my father said he loves the sound of a house filled with the noise of children. And I was thinking, how ghastly. Nothing against children in particular, but just the idea that he wanted to always be surrounded by the noise of people. For some reason, specifically children. He liked the noise of children. I hated the noise of children, but I also hated the noise of adults. So I am vindicated by the Buddha here, who says we should be free of the sound of voices. And then Venerable Mahamoggallana asks a question. So the Buddha's just given him a bunch of really useful advice about setting up conditions that are suitable for meditation. So then he says, Venerable Mahamoggallana said to the Fortunate One, Bhante, briefly, how is a monk one who is liberated through the elimination of craving, one who has reached the absolute perfection, the absolute freedom from bondage, the absolute spiritual life, the absolute conclusion, one who is best among angels and humans? So in other words, he's asking, what is it that defines an awakened being? How can you say that somebody is awakened? So in other words, he's basically asking for a brief summation of Buddhist practice. And the Buddha gives a beautiful answer. The Buddha says, "Here, Moggallana, a monk has heard, nothing is worth clinging to." So in Pali, this phrase is sabbe dhamma nalang abhinave saya. So this is one of my favorite phrases in the entire Pali canon. So it's one of the summaries of the Dhamma. In a few places, the Buddha summarizes Buddhism into single sentence statements. And this is one of those single sentence expressions of Buddhism. Sabbe dhamma nalang abhinave saya. So sabbe means all. Dhamma here means things. So all things. Nalang, so alang means sufficient or enough or worthy. So nalang means not sufficient, not enough, not worth. And abhinave saya literally means to settle on. So the word nivesa means a settlement, like a village or a camp or a town, a place where people have settled. So the sense of abhinave saya It's translated here as clinging, but a more literal meaning would be settling on. So someplace where you've decided you're going to stay on this for a while. So the Buddha says, nothing whatsoever is worth settling on. Nothing whatsoever is worth making a home on. Nothing whatsoever is worth resting on. So this is, again, this is ultimately a summary of the mind of Buddhist practice. Constantly relinquishing all things. Another example of this is there's a beautiful Dhammapada verse, one of my favorite Dhammapada verses, where the Buddha gives the image of, he says, to cultivate a mind like a swan which constantly leaves home after home behind. So it flies from lake to lake, constantly leaving behind home after home. So this is the mind that we're cultivating. So in every moment, we arrive in a set of conditions, and we immediately leave it behind. We don't try to settle on anything. We don't try to settle anywhere, because we know that all things are temporary. All things are insubstantial. There's nothing you can actually build a home on anywhere. So he says, Moggallana, if a monk has heard nothing is worth clinging to, or nothing is worth settling on, he directly knows all things. Isn't that interesting? If you know that nothing is worth settling on, then that means you understand the nature of all things. You know the fundamental insubstantiality that is the single common thread through all phenomena. All phenomena have this shared trait of being insubstantial, not worth settling on. Not capable of settling on, in fact. There's another way of translating that phrase. Nothing is able to be settled on. So after directly knowing all things, one completely knows all things. So one knows the shared characteristics of all phenomena, that they're insubstantial and can't be settled on. And then from that, one has a complete understanding of all things. In other words, one understands the causal nature through which all phenomena arise. One understands that fundamentally all things arise from emptiness. All things are simply a manifestation of emptiness. After completely knowing all things, the sutta continues, then whatever one feels, whether pleasant, painful, or neutral, then in relation to those feelings, one develops the perception of impermanence, the perception of dispassion, the perception of cessation, and the perception of relinquishment. Those who are familiar with the Anapanasati Sutta will recognize this as being the last 4 steps of the 16-step mindfulness of breathing. But it's also, again, a very straightforward description of how to practice insight meditation. Developing the perception of impermanence, seeing all things as impermanent, insubstantial, constantly changing. Developing the perception of dispassion. Since all things are impermanent, not able to be settled on, not able to make a home out of, not able to rely on or depend upon, then we lose our passion for those things. Why would we passionately seek out something which we can't settle on and which provides no lasting happiness? The perception of cessation. So we recognize that not only are phenomena impermanent, but they're also constantly blinking out of existence. Every moment, all things arise and pass away. Normally, we're so fixated on the apparent existence of things that we completely miss out on the fact that they cease to exist every single moment. So paying attention to the cessation of phenomena then ultimately leads to the final step, which is relinquishment, letting go of all things, allowing all phenomena to slip through the mind without sticking. And the Buddha says, as one develops the perceptions of impermanence, dispassion, cessation, and relinquishment in relation to those feelings, again, the feelings of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, one does not grasp at anything in the world. This is another beautiful phrase in Pali, na kinchi loke upadhyati. This also shows up in the Satipatthana Sutta at the end of every section when the Buddha is giving the description of how to practice Satipatthana. One of the statements he makes is nakinchi loke upadhyati. Nothing whatsoever in the world is clung to. One does not cling to anything in the world. So it says, one does not grasp at anything in the world. Not grasping, one is not agitated. Being unagitated, one personally attains enlightenment and knows birth has been eliminated, the spiritual life has been lived. What was to be done has been done. There will not be more of this. So in other words, through cultivating the perception of impermanence, dispassion, cessation, and relinquishment in relation to the sensations of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, and through, therefore, not grasping at anything in the world, anything whatsoever, then the mind finally attains peace. And that peacefulness then is synonymous with enlightenment. It's the peace of awakening, the peace of relinquishment of all phenomena. So then the Buddha sums up. He says, Moggallana, in this way, briefly, a monk is one who is liberated through the elimination of craving, who has reached the absolute perfection, the absolute freedom from bondage, the absolute spiritual life, the absolute conclusion, one who is best among angels and humans. So the sutta begins with this very practical thing of how to alleviate your drowsiness. Then it moves through considering how we're relating with other people. And cultivating a way of relating to other people that doesn't disturb or derange our mind. And then from that basis of samadhi that arises through dispelling our drowsiness and relating to people in an undisturbing way, then based on that samadhi, then we can develop insight through the contemplations and perceptions he gives in this last paragraph. And that is what leads to full awakening. So that's the end of the sutta. So I think I'll stop my explanations at this point, and I'll take any questions that might have come up. Thank you. Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
Thank you, Bhante, for that sutta. And good morning to some more friends joining in. And if you have questions at any time, feel free to type them in. There's already a couple comments and questions. So Michael says, isn't it true that Venerable Moggallana was an expert at psychic powers? So I find it interesting that the Buddha teleports to him, which in and of itself is a super mundane power. Any significance, or is it irrelevant?
I think it's irrelevant. There's many suttas which have the Buddha teleporting around to various people. And in this case, this is when Mahamoggallana was still cultivating his practice. So the sutta here appears to be before Mahamoggallana attained awakening, and possibly before he had developed his own powers. So I don't put any significance on that per se.
And Jaden, in reference to the perception of light, says, I've often looked at a candle for a while before closing my eyes or visualized the sun.
Yeah, whatever works. Whatever brings a sense of awakeness and alertness to the mind. That's ultimately the purpose of the perception of light, is cultivating alertness of mind.
And both Kumu and Michael, in reference to the sleeping postures, wonder maybe it's because the heart is on the left side, why the Buddha recommends not sleeping on the left side.
I've heard different speculations. I've also heard it has to do with the way the digestive tract moves, which also is asymmetrical, and I think it curls to the right. Anyway, but I've experimented with this, and I found that, yeah, there is actually something about sleeping on the right side that's a little more peaceful than sleeping on the left side. I do sometimes sleep on my back, but I never sleep on my stomach. That's got to be just about the worst sleeping posture known to man. I don't know who came up with that one. And in monasteries, it's actually a very clear injunction: do not sleep on your stomach. So sleeping on your stomach can also trigger lust, which is not recommended if you're trying to live a celibate life.
And Ayavimalañani found the sutta. Thank you, Venerable. It was Anguttara 4,246. And in that, sleeping on the back is like sleeping like a corpse. Sleeping on the left is sleeping like a sensualist. Sleeping on the right, sleeping like a lion. And the Tathagata's posture is jhana. No mention of stomach.
Interesting. No mention of sleeping on the stomach. Okay. Yeah.
And Vlad says, so is it that we don't need any arguments anymore?
Well, rather, before engaging in argument, really ask yourself why. What's your purpose? And also asking yourself if it's really going to bring any benefit to the people involved. Because sometimes it is actually useful to have discussions about things. But even if we're engaging in a discussion or a debate, it's important to do so in a serene way, a peaceful way, a way that's not agitating and stirring up your mind, and which hopefully is not agitating the other person, and which is helping both people come to a deeper understanding of the Dhamma. So it's possible to discuss something without arguing. It's even possible to have a debate that is not argumentative. But ultimately, it comes down to looking at the results. What effect does it have on your mind? How is it affecting you? Yeah, most of the time, arguing is not really of any benefit. But sometimes discussion is of benefit.
And Gita asks, Bhante, is it normal that as we walk this path, we will no longer care about noises? Right now, I tend to walk away when it gets noisy.
So when your equanimity is strong, then noise tends to be less of a problem. And it's also good to actively cultivate equanimity towards sound if that's habitually an issue for you. So if you do have problems with being annoyed or bothered by sound, then I actually recommend doing mindfulness of hearing, mindfulness of sound as a meditation practice for a while. So actually actively paying attention to sound with attentiveness, with interest, and with equanimity. And then you'll find it gets much easier. Because the truth is that there's always some amount of sound. It's very rare to be somewhere that's completely silent. So it's important to learn how to not be bothered by sound. Okay?
And Michael says, some ancient monasteries in India that I visited last year were huge, thousands of monks. I wonder if they maintain noble silence or ignoble talking.
I don't know. Hard to say. Yeah.
And Elaine says, I need a Teflon coating for my mind.
I don't understand.
Probably that her mind isn't that strong yet to handle noise and other disruptions.
Oh, is Teflon the non-stick coating?
I think so.
Like, so things don't stick to the mind?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But actually what we're doing, as I see it, it's not so much that we're applying a non-stick surface to the mind, but rather we're recognizing that the mind also is insubstantial, which means that things just flow right through it without sticking. Things only stick in the mind when we grab them. And if you stop grabbing at things, then they just drift right through the mind without sticking.
And Jaden says, seems like a rhetorical question, but why be attached to so many things that are impermanent? Even with the death of a loved one, being attached seems to cause so much suffering.
Yeah. And the answer is because we're delusional. That's why we do these things. Yeah. Okay.
And Dan says, Bhante, I noticed when I spent some time at a monastery that in the kitchen we would talk. There were many opportunities to talk about Dhamma, which was very special, but I also felt some agitation. Sometimes certain thoughts would echo in the mind. I wonder, what are your thoughts on this?
Be silent. Those are my thoughts. So there's something which I've noticed. So I've seen similar things at monasteries. Kitchens tend to be a place of a lot of chatter. So I remember times when I would be working in the kitchen and there would be a lot of talking going on. And then somebody would walk through the kitchen completely silently. And there was something about seeing somebody moving through the kitchen space in complete silence that kind of like gives everybody else this sense of perspective of like, wait a minute, what are we doing? Why are we doing all of this talking? Is this really necessary? Is this really helpful? Is this really beneficial? And sometimes the talking would simmer down after that, and sometimes it wouldn't. But I was having that moment of contrast. So yeah, I would say be careful when going. If you know that the kitchen in a particular monastery is a noisy, talkative place, then be careful. Before going in, remind yourself, I'm about to enter a noisy, talkative place, and I want to keep my mind peaceful and restrained. So setting up your equanimity, setting up your metta, go into the space, help out with whatever work is going on, but be careful not to get involved in frivolous conversation. And actually, if there is Dhamma conversation, then sometimes the thing to say is like, oh, this sounds like a really interesting topic. Maybe let's meet later this afternoon to talk about it. Or maybe, oh, let's bring this up during the Q&A with the monks and see what conversation emerges with the monks around this topic. But yeah, you're not obligated to engage in conversation just because it's happening around you. It actually can be really interesting just to practice mindfulness of the body as you're doing your kitchen work. And to be aware of the sound, but to cultivate being unaffected by it. To just hear it as birds chirping. Not something that you need to be involved in. Okay.
And Avis says, is it wrong to get attached to nice feelings or bliss from meditation?
Well, wrong is a strong word here. Rather, I would say that attachment to the bliss of meditation is an intermediary step which can be of benefit in that it strengthens your desire for meditation practice. It strengthens your commitment to samadhi. So it can therefore help you in strengthening your samadhi practice so that ultimately you can cultivate the wisdom which leads to relinquishing desire for all forms of pleasure, including the pleasure of samadhi. So I would say that attachment to the pleasure of meditation is a stepping stone on the path to awakening. It's not the final goal, but it can be a helpful step along the way. So in the beginning, often what we're doing is we're replacing attachment to sensual pleasure with attachment to the pleasure of meditation. That's actually a really useful step. In fact, the Buddha himself speaks about it in this way. He says that the way to overcome attachment to sensual pleasure is through experiencing the euphoric pleasure of samadhi. So we're basically just directing that sensual desire towards something wholesome, rather than towards something that is unbeneficial and just pulls us away from the path. Okay?
And on Instagram, there's a comment, no matter how hard I try, I can't clear my mind. I'm either thinking about random things or thinking about clearing my mind. I've been trying for years.
Stop trying. You don't need to force your mind to be quiet. And you don't need to think about clearing your mind. That's clearly not going to achieve much of anything. Rather, cultivate equanimity towards the noise in your mind. The same as you cultivate equanimity towards the sound of the birds and the sound of the airplanes and the sound of the traffic and the sound of your air conditioning and the sound of your own heartbeat even. In a really quiet room, you start to hear your own body. This is really interesting. You can actually hear your own heartbeat if you're paying attention and if the room is quiet enough. Yeah, so cultivate equanimity towards the noise in your mind. And the noise in your mind won't necessarily go away, but it will stop bothering you. And when it stops bothering you, then that's just as good as if it's not there. Okay?
And Angela says, my meditation visualizations for alertness often become wildly imaginative. For example, imagining the mind as an ocean or metta as an outstretching lotus. I wonder if these visualizations are harmful or if they're beneficial.
Well, ultimately it depends on the results. But in your case, I would say it sounds like it's probably better for you to stay away from visualizations. Because if it's leading towards daydreaming, if it's leading towards imagination, then that's usually not particularly productive. In fact, that tends to just lead to a lot of wasted time. I remember talking to one person who had been coming to meditation programs diligently for many years. And I was talking to them, and at one point they revealed that every time they sit down to meditate, they actually just start imagining storylines and events and all kinds of fascinating, interesting, basically generating their own cartoons in their head for the entire meditation period. And that's all they ever do. And I was just blown away. I was like, in other words, you've been wasting your time. Like all this time that it looks like you've been meditating, you've actually just been wasting time. And she was like, yeah, that's about right. Yeah, I mean, you can be sitting in perfect full lotus posture. From the outside, looks like you're doing great meditation, but on the inside, you're just imagining all kinds of pretty things. And that's not meditation, that's just wasting time. So I would recommend that you practice mindfulness of the body. Feel this throbbing, meaty chunk of pain and pleasure. It's right here. This leaky bag of bloody meat. It's right here, right now. You can feel it. Pinch your ears. Ow, ow, ow. Actually, a really effective one, which I just did, is take your thumbnail and drive it into your opposite palm. Ow. Mindfulness of the body. It's right here. You can't ignore it. And this is not a fantasy. This is not imagination. This is real as anything can be said to be real. This is real. This meaty chunk right here that hurts when you stab it with your thumbnail. Feel this body. Feel it for what it really is. And this also cultivates alertness. The more attentively you pay attention to the body with a mind of genuine curiosity, then the more awake the mind becomes. So visualization practice can be helpful for some people, but for many people it just leads to spaciness and daydreaming and imagination, which is not Buddhism. That does not lead to awakening. It just leads to more delusion. Okay?
And Amaranta says, sometimes when I'm practicing impermanence and observing my thoughts rising and disappearing, I feel some agitation and think that if I continue, maybe I will become some kind of cold person.
Then practice metta. So keep doing the perception of impermanence because it's very valuable. It's a very potent way of cultivating serenity of mind. very potent way of cultivating contentment. But also make sure to practice loving kindness and compassion. That's what will counteract the coldness that you're speaking about. And also recollect that all the awakened beings of the past cultivated the perception of impermanence to its ultimate conclusion. And they came out of that with boundless compassion. So clearly, the result of Buddhist practice is not coldness. It's not this self-centered coldness, but rather is this bright, spacious, all-embracing, loving compassion. That's the mind of wisdom. That's the mind of awakening. So there's nothing to be afraid of in cultivating the perception of impermanence. But if you do notice the mind drifting towards coldness, then make an extra effort to build up your metta and your karuna. And do things. So not just as meditation practices, but actually doing things for other people, doing kind things for other people, as well as doing the meditation practices of loving kindness and compassion. Okay?
And it seems like the last question is from Edward, who says, I live in a small apartment and I like to sit in meditation in the morning, but at that time my wife is getting dressed, so sometimes it's very loud. I've taken to wearing earplugs. Is that okay?
Yeah, whatever works. Yeah, one of the monastics who I have a lot of respect for, so her name is Venerable Panyavati, is a bhikkhuni with her own monastery in North Carolina. Yeah. She likes to meditate with earplugs and what's that thing that covers your eyes? Sleeping mask. So she'll put on a sleeping mask and put in her earplugs. And she said that for her, that actually really helps her get into samadhi very quickly. Yeah, so you can, if earplugs help you, then they help. Ultimately, it's about doing what works.
I don't know if there's any in-person questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this particular sutta talks about handling dullness when it's already fully present.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if there's a sutta that tells you about handling the subtle, progressive dullness that will eventually end up in the full-blown dullness.
So Denise is asking if there's a sutta which deals with the subtle progression of dullness, which eventually leads to this point where you're falling asleep during meditation. And I'd actually say that there's many suttas which speak about what contributes to dullness and drowsiness in the mind. There's quite a number of them. So it's important to be very vigilant of the mind and really notice like what is building up drowsiness. Try to catch it in its earliest stages possible. And the moment you notice that something you're doing is contributing to dullness or drowsiness, then change, do something different. Or switch your attitude towards it so that stops happening. Because once it progresses to the point where you're actually losing consciousness, then it's pretty hopeless. There's really not much you can do. I've had times when I drifted off towards the beginning of a period of meditation and then was completely unconscious for an hour. Sitting up, but completely unconscious for an hour until the bell rang to end the meditation. That's not really anything you can do about that. When you get to that point, there's not really anything you can do except try to do better next time. But if you watch the mind, you'll notice that drowsiness doesn't just hit you all at once. It gradually builds up. So you want to try to notice when it first appears, that first little like slight haziness of mind. And the moment you notice the mind starting to haze a little bit, you sharpen your attention. Sharpening the mind. So that it doesn't go beyond that. Okay? And also noticing how, again, the Buddha in this sutta and in many others, he talks about how It's not just what we do in our meditation, but it's what we do the rest of our time as well. How are we relating to other people? How are we relating to the activities in our life? What's our thoughts and attitudes towards our possessions, towards our activities? Because all of that shapes the tendencies of mind when we go into meditation practice. So meditation practice doesn't exist in isolation from the rest of our life. What we're doing in every moment affects what happens during our meditation. So if we're cultivating dullness throughout the day, then our meditation is going to be pretty dull. Great example of this is if you hate your job. If you hate your job, then you're going to spend at least 8 hours a day wishing that you weren't experiencing what you're experiencing. So then you're going to have drowsiness during meditation, naturally, because you're spending 8 hours a day training your mind to not want to be present for its experience. So you can either learn how to love your job or you can get a different job. Those are really your only options. Otherwise, you're going to have drowsiness in your meditation. Yeah, a bad attitude towards your life is one of the greatest ways to build up your dullness. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, in terms of those four perceptions, the impermanence, dispassion, cessation, and relinquishment, the fourth one, can you talk a little bit about the Pali word and its etymology, please?
So Sam is asking about the word relinquishment. So the word is patinissagga. So it's from the word nissajati, which literally means to put down. So patinissagga just means completely putting down, basically. Okay? Yeah. Anything else? Okay, maybe that's it for now.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us for this morning's sutta study and for all your comments and questions. If there was anything we didn't get to address or any lingering questions, feel free to bring them to Monk Chat tomorrow evening. That's Friday at 7:30 p.m. New York City time, where you can ask a group of monastics all your questions related to Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha.
And there is actually special news that I forgot to inform you, Bhante Suddhaso perhaps, but starting next week, we will have an extra sutta study morning class led by Venerable Vimalanjani. So Tuesday mornings at 8 a.m.
Oh, great.
Yeah, good stuff. So yeah, our usual schedule plus Tuesday 8 a.m. and we'll announce it properly.
Great. Sadhu.
Great. Yes, just check our live stream schedule on YouTube or on the website.
Oh, and there's also Venerable Vimalanjani will be also leading starting next week. That's a Zoom workshop on to continue our Therigatha special, or her Therigatha special, our, like as in worldwide Therigatha special. So we will send it through our newsletter, all the information that you need to sign up for. I think it's like a 6 session workshop that will be spread throughout the weeks. So if you are not on our newsletter, well, sign up to the newsletter on the website, or you can send us an email at info@emptycloud.org and we'll send you all the information. And now I'm seriously done.
Thank you, Ayasama. And Avis asked, how do you join Monk Chat? You just come to the live stream like this one. So it's part of the regularly scheduled live streams. So just log in either on YouTube or Facebook to join, and then you can type your questions and the monastics will address them at that time. So thanks everyone for all your attention. As always, we can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
And enjoy the rest of your day.